I'm tired! Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Conscience of the King, which is episode 13 of season 1 of Star Trek The Original Series. That is, of course, going by production date, which, in my opinion, is the only proper way to judge the season 1 of the original series, not air date. So if the number seems off, that's why. Anywho, this video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user poll. The episode to win my latest poll for the original series was The Conscience of the King. Or to be more specific, it was a tie between The Conscience of the King and Cat's Paw. And as in the case of ties, I'm the tiebreaker, and I'd rather review The Conscience of the King than Cat's Paw. So, The Conscience of the King is the episode where a group of actors come on board the Enterprise whom Kirk suspects one of them of being the infamous TOS the Executioner, who killed, I believe, over 4,000 people on the colony that he lived on, and he was one of the witnesses, one of the few eyewitnesses left alive who could ID the person, and all the other ones had been killed off. So Kirk was investigating and discovers that it was in fact his daughter who was killing the remaining eyewitnesses. And in a rage, when he approaches the daughter, she tries to kill Kirk, but instead kills her own father and then goes insane. So, I think this is... I never liked this episode growing up. I always thought it was really boring. It was a skippable episode for me. And I think it was one that the syndication kind of shied away from too. Because it was, I believe, one of the last episodes of the original series I saw, because I was watching it on syndication. And the few ones that I didn't see, I had to go out and rent them from Blockbuster. They had like every VHS for every episode of the original series, and this was one of them. I know the Empath was another one, because apparently that was too violent for TV, so I think the syndication shied away from that one. This one I read just now on Wikipedia, or Memory Alpha, that the network shied away from this episode because it was deemed as not action or orientated enough and too talky. Now, I tend to like talky episodes, and I always talk about how I don't need to have all this action suspense. And I think the best original series episodes are more intellectual than they are just, oh, here's some hot chicks or some phaser action, which is why I love the alternative factor. Although most people despise that episode, but I've covered that in a different video. However, in the case of this episode, I kind of agreed with well, it's boring. Now, I have reevaluated this episode in a later life and come to appreciate it a bit more. And watching it now, just now, to analyze it for this review, I think it's a great idea that was done poorly. I think that is my ultimate conclusion. Because I love the concept of having the concept of TOS the Executioner, who, if you're unaware, the background information for TOS the Executioner is that he was governor of this colony where some kind of famine wiped out all their food supply, and that there was not enough food to feed the colony, and before the next shipment arrived, and people were going to slowly starve to death. So he decided to painlessly execute half of the population, which he personally chose. He personally decided who would live and who would die based off of what he deemed the merit, or who would benefit the colony most. And after he murdered half of the colony, the supply ships actually arrived early, meaning that he didn't need to kill them at all. That had he not killed anyone, because the supply ships arrived early, no one would have died. And yeah, so that is the background of Kodos the Executioner. Now this episode treats it that James Kirk was there as a young man and witnessed this, and in fact was one of the few eyewitnesses who actually saw Kodos the Executioner in person. And so was Kevin Riley, who is a character who only appeared previous to this in the episode The Naked Time. And so there's an actor who, a good friend of Kirk, who was actually also at the colony, who could also identify Kodos the Executioner, is Kodos the Executioner, even though he's officially reported to have died shortly after the incident. But they suspect his body was never found, so they suspect that he faked his death and is now living his life as an actor. So that's an extremely interesting concept to me. And I do think that that's really fascinating. But the episode doesn't really it doesn't really explore this concept the most. In fact, I'm sure if this episode was done in modern times with a modern budget and not, the 60s, with this fake budget, which I'll get into, fake budget, short at this small budget where everything looked incredibly fake, that they would have, I can imagine, if this was done as an episode of Discovery or Battlestar Galactica or even Deep Space Nine or something like that this episode would be intercut with flashbacks of the colony and flashbacks showing Kodos the Executioner the events actually going down, instead of just having these events relayed in dialogue. And I actually think that the episode would have been, I want to say 10 times better, but maybe that's an exaggeration, maybe 5 times better, if that would have happened, because I think you lose a lot. And in fact, I think the first time, and maybe the first couple times I saw this episode, I didn't fully catch the background story, because it's just quickly sped over in dialogue, and quite clunky, obvious exposition dialogue, by the way, between Spock and McCoy. It's when he says, and when he's telling McCoy about the colony, it's he's like, I know who Kodos the Executioner is, and Spock's like, oh, you may not know the whole story, and tells him what I just explained, but why wouldn't McCoy know the whole story? I think McCoy does know the whole story. You know who doesn't know the whole story? The audience. And so it's just a very clunky way to relay exposition, whereas had they actually had flashbacks to the events, it would have been awesome. As an audience member, you would have identified with it more. You would have felt more of Kirk and O'Reilly's anger, to actually feel it and see it visually. Now, I understand, again, this is the original series. They had no budget. And even, I'm trying to imagine what it would look like if the original series tried to do flashbacks. It would be an obvious soundstage with, 20 people standing in for what's supposed to be the entire population of the colony, which is something, to be fair, that occurred in Star Trek all the way up to, Deep Space Nine and Voyager. So it wouldn't have looked good, in other words. But I could just imagine, them doing this actually properly, doing it justice with sort of modern technology and modern budgets. And I think it would have been a much, much better episode for it. Now, the other issue I had with this episode is, as I said, I think it's boring. Now, I guess I'll get more into the Shakespearean theme of the episode. Now, Shakespeare is a reoccurring theme in Star Trek, and it actually began here. In fact, when I bought the DVD for the original series, they only had only in a few episodes, 1 or 2 episodes per season, they had text commentary, and they chose this episode, which I was surprised by, because most of the episodes they choose are like classic episodes, like Balance of Terror, Mirror Mirror, City on the Edge of Forever, like, or Trouble with Tribbles, the episodes that are most classic and most noted. This had always been, in my opinion, and from my research, a general opinion as well, an average throwaway episode that didn't get much attention. So I was actually quite surprised that they had text commentary for this episode, and I watched it, and it mainly talked about Shakespeare and how, and I was like, okay, so that's why they chose this, because they wanted to highlight Star Trek's relationship with Shakespeare and how it basically began with this episode. I'm not a huge Shakespeare fan. Like, I recognize its place in literary history and how it is an inspiration for a lot of art, literature, and especially plays, film, and television in modern times. And I recognize it for that, and I appreciate it for that. But I don't really like watching his plays or adaptations or film adaptations of his plays, although the only film adaptations I like of his plays are the ones that completely modernize it. I'm not talking about partially modernize it, like this Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio, where it's taking place in modern times, but they still speak in the Shakespearean language, which that bothers me. That actively irks me. If you're going to modernize it, fully modernize it and have them speak in modern tongue, if you will. and again, I fully appreciate it for its historical place in literary history and for the influence that it has on future writers up to this very day. But I don't personally like that style. The poetic way of speaking actively bothers me and makes it hard to find. I know I'm young, stupid, or whatever, but I think people who think that people are less intelligent for not liking Shakespeare or the poetic way they think are pretentious assholes, personally. Speaking, just my opinion. And I don't particularly care much for, I think the stories are overly bloated. And they're too long and they drag. And maybe that's why I don't like this episode, because it was done in the Shakespearean style. Although, by anyone's admission, not as good as Shakespeare. So it was like a not even a close facsimile, more like and I say a cheap facsimile, I think is being too harsh. Maybe I'll just use the term facsimile and don't put a qualifier to it. It's a facsimile of a Shakespearean story, and so it's obviously not going to be as good as an actual Shakespeare play, or even an adaptation of one. And I don't like that style in the first place, so I wouldn't like a facsimile of one even less. Now, I actually think that the Shakespearean tones of this episode hurt it, and I think they would be better off had they left it. Now, this has a lot to do, and I might one of these days, because I did a video once, it was on a whim, I didn't even put much thought into it, about my favorite Star Trek actors in Star Trek, and that became my most viewed video on Star Trek on my channel, which it shocked me that it did. And I never intended, honestly did not put as much thought into it, but I've gotten, and it's not too bad at the moment, but the videos that have more views is the ones I get more trolling comments on, or more comments of people disagreeing with me and being rude and whatnot, and making stupid accusations and shit for something that I didn't even put that much thought into. I never intended for it to get as many views as it did. The reason why I'm bringing that up now, and I have intended to revisit that for a while now, but one of these days I'll get around to it. But the reason why I bring that up now is because I noticed, like, in my opinion of acting is different now than it was, say, 20 years ago, and it's because I've been educated. I attended university where I took drama class, and I acted in plays, and I joined drama club, and I directed some really minor plays, just community theater, nothing important. And of course, some minor short film, and then that led me to films, and I directed a couple of minor, no one saw short films, and then I went to film school, and then I got a bit more of a film credit involved in some short films and whatnot that were actually filmed in festivals and whatnot and all that sort of thing. So I'm not a professional by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm not uneducated. And so I have personal experience with directing actors and acting myself. And and again, not a professional, just an amateur, but not completely uneducated. And my personal experience in the way, particularly with film school, is because the film school I went to was really getting you ready for, it was in New Zealand, so they were basing you for a job in the film industry in New Zealand. And the main genre, I should say, or the main sort of crux of New Zealand films is art house, slice of life films. Which is very different than, say, genre sci-fi or action or whatnot. And that's not to say there's no action and sci-fi in New Zealand films, but it's just rare. The focus is on sort of the art house. Like, I was getting so sick of seeing films about old people and kids, especially the old people with kids, because that is the cliche, stereotypical art house clickbait. I don't want to call it clickbait. It's an unoriginal staple of our house. Oh, let's just put an old person with a young kid, and oh, isn't that cool? But anyway, I'm digress. The point of the story is I was trained to look at the difference between film acting and play acting. And I would group, when I say film acting, I'm talking about television as well. I'm grouping that together. Instead of saying film and television, I'll just say film. But basically film and television. Visual, where there's a camera that's actually recording you, as opposed to you're on a stage live performing to people. And they really drilled down the difference between film and stage acting. And I noticed with that video I made about the Star Trek actors, the reason why I was constantly bumping heads is because I feel like they were basing it off of theatrical acting. And now here's the thing, and this is what I noticed in my own personal studies, is that the further back in time you go to film and television history, the closer it resembles theatrical acting. Because when the birth of film, going back to the earliest 20th century, the only form of that kind of visual storytelling where people were actually acting things out with acting was theater. So they based it strictly off of theater. But as film and television evolved, they noticed that there was a difference between having a camera have a close-up where you see their face and their eyes right there, as opposed to if you're on a stage performing to people who are like way the fuck out there, seeing your entire body move. It's a huge difference, and the main difference is that film and television is a lot more subtle. And as I said, and that's why I go back and watch stuff from the 60s, especially stuff like the original Star Trek with William Shatner, is that it's more theatrical. They're overacting, and it's seen as overacting from a modern perspective. Of course, in that time period, it wasn't seen as overacting. It was kind of seen as a norm. But it's just as time went on, especially you get into the most modern 21st century art house films, which, as I said, is how I was trained, is very minimal dialogue, very minimal reaction, and they focus on the subtleties. And so that's why I bumped heads with a lot of people in my actors things, because they were saying, why didn't you have Avery Brooks on there? But in my opinion, from the way I was educated, Avery Brooks is not a good film actor. He might be a good theatrical actor, but he's way too over the top. But I guess a lot of Star Trek fans are probably used to that, because the original series, and even with Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, were a bit more theatrical and less subtle, less sort of modern, and so that might be the norm, and that's why maybe I had a different perspective. When I judge acting, I judge based the difference between film and theatrical, and that's also why William Shatner was nowhere. And when people would suggest William Shatner, I kind of mocked them. I was like, he's not a good actor. I'm sorry. Spock. And that's not saying that I'm right and they're wrong. That's saying it's because of the way I was trained and the perspective that I'm coming from. Because when I was younger, before I had this education, I had that same perspective. I was more of the melodrama, and I would write short stories or whatnot, and they would tend to be more of the melodrama. In fact, after I was educated, I showed someone in my school some of my earlier works, and they said this is way too melodramatic, over the top. So it's just a different sort of style and perspective or way at looking things. Okay, so that was a really, really long aside just to get to the point, to the fact that this episode is completely overacting. Now, it is trying to be Shakespearean, and I know that all of the original series is overacting. I talked about this when I talked about the alternative factor, because one of the main complaints is that guest actor was a bad overactor, which I think is a ludicrous complaint to have for an episode of the original series where the entire fucking thing is over to the top overacting. Not just Shatner, but everyone, especially guest stars. So I think that was a ludicrous complaint. However, when it comes to this episode, I think I would level that complaint on this episode, because it's intentionally using theatrical style acting in a TV show. And I think the actor who plays Kodos the Executioner in this episode is way worse than the one from Alternative Factor. Not in terms of being a worse actor, but in terms of being too theatrical, being an over actor, as opposed to getting the point across. And like that thing that I did, a little preamble I did at the start of my video where it goes, I am tired, because that's something that even as a kid I knew that was ridiculous and over the top, and that's something I'd always quote to myself. In fact, I still do it to this day. I've done it for over 20 years. Usually when I'm by myself, but when I feel tired, instead of going, boy, I'm tired, I go, I am tired! Just kind of making fun of just how over the top this actor was. And also the woman, the Caridian's daughter, she was played more of, and I actually didn't mind her performance that much, but it was very much a factor of the time. It's very much in the 60s. It's kind of, especially the way the cinematography, the way they filmed her, did remind me a lot of Hitchcock. So I think they were going for a Hitchcock style esque, and I believe Hitchcock was around this time period. I'm sorry, I'm not very well educated, but I'm pretty sure. Anyway, because it seems even if it wasn't Hitchcock himself, it's that same kind of like style where it's more of the stereotypical, almost what's the word I'm looking for? Almost sort of chauvinistic view of the manic woman that was probably, especially from a modern perspective, is a really sort of sexist way to view women, but it's very common that, women are too emotional and over the top. And when they played one who was in film and television who was particularly supposed to be like having mental issues, they would go over the top with this, and so this seems sort of very cliche that you would find a lot of performances similar to this in the 60s, which I mean, that's not to say that there's no women who would behave like this in real life, but well, certainly not exactly like this because it is overacting, but who wouldn't have sort of the same mental issues. It's the way that most of the film and television of the 60s and 50s and earlier decades treated. And that is a common complaint about the original series, that it does tend to stereotype women as sort of having soft, being more soft and fair, more emotional, over the top. And then there was that episode, Turnabout Intruder, which I already covered, where they outright said that, had characters on the show, Kirk and Spock, outright say shit like that women are too emotional and over the top. But that's how they were always portrayed in the original series. But again, that's getting into a larger context of how, the portrayal of women in the original series isn't as progressive as some revisionist historians try to treat it, because it was a big deal having women officers serve around the ship. But from Gene Roddenberry's own admission, they just did that so they could have eye candy for the show. It wasn't about equality, and the way they were portrayed certainly backs that up. Now, all of that is to say that I didn't really care for the Caridian's daughter's performance either. I mean, it was a little bit Shakespearean, but especially the way she went over the top after she accidentally killed him. It's like, the play is the thing. And she's still, is quoting Shakespeare and whatnot. That was really melodramatic, and I didn't buy it. Now, to be fair, with the Kodos himself, the only scene that was actually that over the top was the one where Kirk confronts him, and that's the one I quoted where he goes, "I am tired," and he's way over the top. And because the other scenes where he's actually performing, most of the other scenes in episodes, he's actually performing Shakespeare, and that's fine. Like, you can be, because he is in a play, so you can do theatrical acting, because he's actually, even though he's on film, he's portraying someone who is on stage performing to an audience, and so theatrical acting is a lot more excusable. So, and especially Shakespeare, when he's going like, "I am you," that kind of thing. Acting is more acceptable. But the scene where Kirk goes to him, he's not performing on stage. He's just having a conversation in a small room with another human being. And he goes, "I am tired." That's, no. I'm sorry. Maybe it's the way I was trained, but that irks me. Also, just the structure of the episode, I just find boring and tedious. The way, it's Kirk's friend says, "Oh, I know that's Kodos," and we have no idea who Kodos the Executioner. Like, the teaser goes, "Dun dun dun, it's Kodos the Executioner," and as an audience member, you're like, okay, so who the fuck is Kodos the Executioner? Why should I care? And they don't fully explain or let you into the secret that who Kodos the Executioner is and why we should care until later. And so the first half of the episode is mostly just like, Kirk's friends died and no one seems to care. And then Kirk sort of suspecting this, actor of being someone worse. And so he sort of plays, he does use and sort of play the daughter in order to get access to the actor, which she's kind of in the right to be upset about this. But of course, we learn later that she's the murderer, so maybe she doesn't have that strong of a leg to stand on. But the point is, the first half of the episode is really boring and tedious, and I do think this has a concept. It's a very interesting, as I said, the whole concept of having a governor like having to execute half the population because he thought it was mercy. But in fact, and he even said, like, he argued, like, well, if those supply ships came earlier, I would have been seen as a hero. I don't know if I agree with that, but he definitely would have been looked at in a different light. I think he still would have been seen as a mass murderer, and people still would have had a huge issue with him, even if by killing half the population, he saved the other half. A lot of people would still take issue with the way he behaved, but it would be a bit more understandable because with hindsight's 2020, you find out that killing those people was completely unnecessary and there's a way they all could have survived had he just done nothing. Then that does make it a lot worse in people's, the way they view him, a lot worse. Now, and here's the other thing. It's obvious from the very beginning, even before Spock fully does the exposition dump and explains who exactly Kodos the Executioner is, even before we get to that stage, it's beyond obvious that Caridian is Kodos. Like, there's no question. And that also takes a lot of the intrigue and interest of this episode out of it. It sucks it out. And in fact, Kirk is kind of being obtuse to a point, saying, I need to know for sure. I need proof that this is Kodos. Like, even after he had the conversation, which made it beyond clear that this is fucking Kodos, he's still like, I need to be sure. I'm like, God damn it, Kirk, what the fuck is wrong with you? And even Spock is like, no, he's Kodos. No, there's no question. Don't even dot it. And Kirk is like, oh, I don't know. Maybe it's not Kodos. That part of that aspect of it bothered me too. Now, it is interesting that because this, it's obviously not a direct analogy, but it does seem to me that it takes some inspiration of certain people who were living in the U.S. in the 60s who were accused of being Nazis and who served during World War II and were responsible for genocide. And there was, I believe there were several cases where they denied this, of course, but then other people were sure that this was them, that they were responsible for genocide. So it does seem reminiscent of that as well, and that does seem to be an influence. But as I say, it's not a one-to-one analogy because he wasn't quite a Nazi, and the situation is more complex than that. But it's kind of similar where he's moved on with his life and he's become a different person. It is interesting that he opposed the the conversation with Kirk was not the only overacting this guy did. Also, when the daughter revealed that she'd killed the other people, he was like, more blood on my hands. Like, he's not even performing on stage at the moment. It's like, come on. It's so dumb. But anyway, it was interesting that that he was morally opposed to what she was doing and that he wanted to forget and erase the past and try to truly become a new person, which again brings up another moral dilemma. If he did become a better person, if he lived his life like really good and actually did well for society and just tried to erase the events of what happened, his mistake that happened on the colony, would he still be as deserving of death as Kirk and O'Reilly, who lived through that, believed him to be? And that's a very interesting dilemma that this episode doesn't address. And so that's another way that this episode actually could have been way better if they explored issues like that more, rather than the stupid scenes where Kirk is trying to hit on the girl and they had the cheesy and the overacting. So that's not to say that I think this is a terrible episode. As I said, I do appreciate it more than I used to, but I do think it could have been way better than it was, especially if it was made in modern times where they did flashbacks and we actually saw the events. Like, they could have actually sprinkled it in, so not tell the audience right away exactly what the deal with Kodos the Executioner is. You could see a young Kirk on the colony and then say, oh, the food's running out or whatever, blah, blah. And as we get closer to maybe the midpoint of the episode, that's when you reveal who you actually show the events of him murdering the people rather than just an exposition dump with Spock. I don't know. I still think that maybe even in the 60s, even with the incredible low budget, it would have looked cheap and rank. But I think there's still a way they could have done this, and it still would have been way better than what they did do. Just my opinion. Anyway, I do have to talk about this one scene that, oh my god, I think is so fucking funny. I think I do laugh every time I saw it, and it's something I used to make fun of. So when O'Reilly's in engineering, and here, before I get to the funny scene, let me preface this. So Kirk sends O'Reilly down to engineering, and when he learns that he was at the colony, he could identify Kodos the executioner, but he doesn't tell anyone. Nobody knows why. Everyone's like, why the fuck are you punishing him? He's like, mind your own damn business. Anyway, so it's obvious that he sent O'Reilly there because he was kind of using him as bait. But why is he not, like, you would think if that's the case, why isn't he monitoring O'Reilly at all times? Like, an assassination attempt is made. In fact, it would have been successful had he not been talking to Uhura at the time it was made. Like, he was able to cry for help, and they got to him in time. But Kirk seemed to have absolutely no... That was really careless of him. So I don't know why the fuck he wasn't monitoring, especially if he set him up like that to be bait. Bait's not successful unless you actually watch it and make sure you catch it. But of course he didn't do that because he's dumb. Also, like, there's a line for after O'Reilly is in sickbay and McCoy is like... talking about how O'Reilly's life is hanging in the balance. Will he live and die? And McCoy's like, he better not die, because if he does, that means Jem is the only one left who can identify Kodos. That seems rather callous. And it's like, oh, fuck O'Reilly. I don't care if he dies. I just don't want Jem to die. It's like, well, I hope he lives so he can be the bait, and so they'll try to kill him again and leave Jem alone. That's what it seemed like to me. Anywho, let me get into the ridiculous, funny scene that I sort of teased earlier, and that is when O'Reilly was poisoned. They show a scene of someone... God, it's so fucking hilarious. Putting the poison in his milk, and they use this. It is exactly something, a spray bottle that looks exactly like this, and they spray. Oh my god! I have to, the 60s was several decades before I was born, but I just have to assume that looked ridiculous even when it first came out. Why? Why is someone who's poisoning someone else using Windex? And every time I see it, it's like, oh no, they're putting Windex in your milk. Oh my god. That's so stupid. Hold on, let's see if I can get it working. I guess there's none on this. Here we go. I guess I might be poisoned now. This is the 23rd century. Like, even in the 60s, like, someone would want to poison someone's drink, they would use, like, a syringe or a dropper or something like that. Not a Windex bottle. Anyway. My rating for The Conscience of the King out of 10. I'm going to give this a 6 good. I don't think it's a bad episode, because I think the premise does take it a long way. I think it is a very interesting character story for Kirk, knowing that he has this background, even though it's never ever mentioned again in Star Trek canon, which is frustrating. It should have been at least referenced, but whatever. It is interesting that Kirk had that background, and he was able to face his demons and come face how this man could simply be someone who was responsible for these atrocities that affected his life. But so it's still a good episode, and I still like it for that. But As I said, the execution has a lot to be desired. That this concept is an interesting concept that actually could have been done way better, less boring, better structure, more focus on the actual more focus on the actual events rather than just doing an exposition dump, and more they could have explored the moral dilemma involved in the situation better than they did, and of course with less overacting. The more blood on my hands. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Conscience of the King. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many more Star Trek videos, as well as videos on other shows like The Expanse, Better Call Saul, The Outer Limits, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.